Okay, I'm now going to pass the torch over to Montreal, to our newly elected City Councillor for the City of Laval, Aram Elagos, to make the introductions to begin the next panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So it's a pleasure to be here today in this very interesting and important event. So my name is Arme Lagos. So I'm a research scientist by training and also newly elected municipal councillor in Laval. So I am very pleased to introduce today's moderator, Lali Manjikian. Lali is a humanities professor at Vanier College in Montreal. Her teaching and research interests are in the areas of human rights, migration, refugee, social inclusion and exclusion, migrant narratives, media representations of migration and diaspora studies. She is the author of Collective Memory and Home in the Diaspora, the Armenian Community in Montreal in 2008. Lali's have articles which have been published in a number of newspapers and journals, including the Armenian Weekly, Horizon Weekly, 100 Lives, the Aurora Prize, the Montreal Gazette, and Refuge. A past Birthright Armenia participant in 2005, over the years, Lali has been active in volunteering both within the Armenian community in Montreal and within the local community at large, namely engaged in immigrant and refugee integration. She holds a PhD in communication studies from McGill University in 2013. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the final panel today entitled Canada's Role as a Human Rights Leader. As we all know, human rights occupy an important place in Canadian society's social fabric. Canadians have played a vital role in the evolution of human rights, both in Canada and on the international stage. It is a great honor to have among us three of those Canadians, well, currently two, but we're hoping that Mr. Erwin Cutler will shortly join. It's a great honor to have among us three of those Canadians who have directly contributed to the advancement of human rights and whose work continues to impact countless lives here in Canada and abroad. Thank you so much for being here. Please allow me to now introduce our panelists, and I'll begin with the Honorable Erwin Cutler. He is the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former member of Parliament, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Cutler intervened in landmark Charter of Rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. As Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Mr. Cutler initiated the first ever comprehensive reform of the Supreme Court appointment process and helped make it the most gender representative Supreme Court in the world. Appointed the first ever Aboriginal and visible minority justices to the Ontario Court of Appeal, initiated the first ever law on human trafficking, crafted the Civil Marriage Act, the first ever legislation to grant marriage equality to gays and lesbians, and issued Canada's first national justice initiative against racism and hate. Professor Cutler also made the pursuit of international justice a government priority, including heading the Canadian delegation to the Stockholm Conference on the Prevention and Combating of Genocide. Furthermore, he intervened in the Mugesera case, which established the important principle and precedent that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. An international human rights lawyer, Professor Cutler has served as counsel to prisoners of conscience, including Nelson Mandela in South Africa and Professor Saad Eddin Ibrahim in Egypt, among many others. He is the recipient of 11 honorary doctorates, where he has been recognized as, quote, a scholar and advocate of international stature. He has been named an Officer of the Order of Canada, Canada's highest civilian award, and he is the recipient also of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, as well as other countless awards for his leadership and implication in human rights. We'll now move on to the Honorable Anthony Housefather, who was elected as Member of Parliament for Mount Royal on October 19, 2015. In February 2016, he was elected as Chairman of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, which has the power to examine and produce reports on the policies, programs, and expenses of the Department of Justice. Mr. Housefather holds 2 law degrees from McGill University and an MBA from Concordia University's John Molson School of Business. Until he was elected an MP, he served as Executive Vice President Corporate Affairs and General Counsel at Dialogic Corporation. Mr. Housefather was first elected to office in 1994. He was initially elected as a municipal councillor in Hampstead, then elected in Côte-Saint-Luc, Hampstead, Montreal West, and served as mayor of Côte-Saint-Luc between 2005 and 2015. On a personal level, Mr. Housefather has been a volunteer for many years within a number of organizations serving the English-speaking and Jewish communities. And finally, we'll move on to Mr. Kyle Matthews, who is the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, also known as MIGS, at Concordia University. He joined MIGS as lead researcher of the Will to Intervene project in 2008 and was appointed Senior Deputy Director in 2011. At Concordia, he founded the Raoul Wallenberg Legacy of Leadership Project, as well as the Digital Mass Atrocity Preventing Lab, which works to counter online extremism and study how social media platforms are being used as a weapon of war. His work focuses on human rights, international security, the responsibility to protect, global threats in social media and technology, and global cities. He works closely with the Canadian All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide and has advised members of Parliament on issues related to international peace and security. He previously worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, where he was posted in the Southern Caucasus, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in Geneva, Switzerland. Prior to that, he worked for CARE Canada in Albania, and later at its headquarters in Ottawa, where he managed various humanitarian response initiatives and peace-building projects in Afghanistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. Mr. Matthews is currently a fellow at the Canadian Institute for Global Affairs and a research fellow at the Canadian Research Institute on Humanitarian Crises and Aid. So without further ado, we'll now move on to our questions. So we have 2 questions. I'll begin with the first one, which will be followed by a question period. We'll take questions from essentially across Canada. So for the first question, just here. What role do you see for Canada at a time when many countries are stepping away from policies that defend human rights, both internally and internationally? So whoever would like to begin.
Rock, paper, scissors?
Sure. 1, 2, 3. We forgot to say who was doing what.
Okay. You got the rock, you go ahead.
Okay.
You start.
Well, you go first on the next question.
So first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you to the people joining us in Toronto and Vancouver and across the country. I'd like to just note for the purposes of those who aren't in the room, I'm joined here by Faisal El-Khoury, who is my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Laval des Îles, and by Mary Diros, who is a city councillor for the city of Montreal, just recently re-elected. And it's a pleasure to have you and our new Laval councillor and other elected officials joining us today. On that question, we live in a very complicated world, and we live in a world that is changing every minute. We're living in a world that has recently seen the election of Donald Trump in the United States and Brexit, and countries moving toward a me first philosophy and exiting the normal world order where the United States played a very important role in guarding and leading in the establishment of human rights through the world. Now, the United States obviously didn't have a perfect foreign policy record and often would prop up right-wing dictators in different countries when it was to their advantage, but you could normally count on the United States expressing real leadership in that area, and Trump signaled a withdrawal of that when he was first elected. The same is true for other countries where you have movements within a country usually on the far right, sometimes on the far left, that discourage countries from looking beyond their borders. And Canada, I think, is a refreshing change in that regard. Our government, whether Chrystia Freeland, whether Justin Trudeau, has signaled to the world that Canada wants to be engaged with the world. And Canada can't be engaged with the world without speaking out forcefully for human rights here and abroad. Focusing on human rights abroad, we've recently sent the Honorable Bob Rae to Myanmar as an investigator for us, as someone who was out there to learn what is happening to the Rohingyas so that we can make concrete findings and then propose real solutions to Aung San Suu Kyi and the government of Myanmar. Trudeau did take the time to speak to her about the Rohingyas. The same is true in terms of talking, as you recall, what happened with Duterte in the Philippines. Trudeau spoke out on human rights and talking about the mass killings of alleged drug dealers in the Philippines, whereas Trump praised Duterte, in the same couple of days. When it's talking about Venezuela and the horrific human rights violations that are going on right now in Venezuela with respect to Leopoldo Lopez, who is represented by Erwin Cutler, and other leaders of the opposition, we have in all hemispheres horrific human rights violations. And Canada, and our government need to play a leadership role. Now, that's not to say that we're always perfect. Canadian human rights record has not been perfect. We can go back to the treatment of Chinese and Japanese migrants to Canada at the turn of the century, our treatment of people of the Jewish faith in the 1930s when we refused to St. Louis, our very late recognition of the Armenian Genocide, our treatment of Indigenous Canadians. But over the last 20 or 30 years, since the 70s really, since our Charter of Rights was adopted, Canada really has proven to be a refreshing leader at home in protecting human rights, in allowing the courts to defend a constitutional supremacy as opposed to parliamentary supremacy. And we now have a government that is prepared to articulate that on the world stage. I think that's important. I think we need to do it. And hopefully we'll continue in that vein.
Thank you for that response. Would you like to
Sure.
chime in?
I'll probably, let me just start by saying thank you to the Armenian community for opening up your school, have this important discussion, to the Armenian National Congress of Canada for organizing this and working with the Jewish community of Canada and Erwin Cutler's new Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. I think it's great that you're having this dialogue across the country to talk about important issues. It's true. What's happening across the world right now? Are human rights actually advancing, or are they not? And I would say that we're not seeing a positive advancement. If you look across the planet right now, we're seeing a rise of liberal democracies, a rise of countries that are questioning liberal principles, the liberal international order. You can look at this in Eastern Europe, where you have the government of Hungary, for example, which has been very, very authoritarian, actually clamping down on universities, including the Open University of Budapest, where Michael Ignatieff is currently the rector. We have some other, I would say, governments, including Hungary, that's pressing down on the free media. The media journalism is actually coming under enormous attack across the planet. No media, no human rights. That's the one way to hold your government to account. So we should be really concerned about what's happening to the media. We see this in the United States. We've seen President Trump actually attack the media. We've seen, we've seen even our NATO ally Turkey, which is also, I would argue, is one of the more troubling aspects of human rights on the planet right now, in which our major NATO ally Turkey is slowly moving away from secularism to become more of a religious state. That has enormous implications for minorities in Turkey. It has enormous implications for all the countries in the region, and it has also enormous implications for our international security if we have a partner that seems to be sharing an ideology with Al-Qaeda more than with his fellow NATO members. So there's a rise of a liberal democracy. But on top of that, I would also see that there's a rise of transnational terrorism. We're seeing now across the planet, 40 years ago, during the height of the Cold War, we actually had 20, 30 conflicts, and it was tended to be kind of the Cold War fight, Soviet Union versus the US, Marxist rebels fighting pro-capitalist rebels. Now in the world, we have at least 20 to 25 conflicts where we have Al-Qaeda-like groups that are fighting and winning and trying to actually take control of states to turn them into to kind of what ISIS had done in Iraq and Syria. This is deeply troubling. It's imposing problems for the international community. Canada's pondering where we're going to go peacekeeping next. There's been talk about Mali, and we actually now have groups in Mali attacking UN peacekeepers. So that shows you how the world has changed. It's not the same world as it was 30, 40 years ago. And transnational non-state actors are actually not afraid about committing mass atrocities, putting them up on YouTube, attracting other vicious people with the same mentality, and actually doing this to kind of intimidate liberal democracies around the world. And I was just in Italy earlier this week with the mayor of Milan and Parliamentarians for Global Action to actually get 200 MPs together to deal with violent extremism and mass atrocities, because this is a growing problem, and some of our key allies need help. So those are 2 points: a liberal democracy and non-state actors and violent extremism. And so this is both a cause of concern, but it's also a cause of opportunity for Canada. As Anthony said, that seems to be the U.S. is pulling back from having an active role in international affairs, pulling back from actively engaging on human rights issues, has fallen into the camp that because of the rise of terrorism that we should close our borders. The big debate right now is actually not the left versus the right. It's being an open country or a closed country. And these are the things that are affecting domestic politics internationally, and also which gives some authoritarians the impulse to attack journalists, to attack opposition parties, and so forth. But let's talk about the opportunities for Canada. I think we have enormous opportunities. I don't think, I agree with Anthony said, is that we have some dark chapters in our history. The way we've treated Indigenous Canadians, we treated certain minorities in the past. However, we have to recognize that whatever we've done, if you look at Canada on a global scale, we're probably among the top country on the planet. And I don't say that being a patriotic Canadian or a nationalist. I'm saying is that people want to live with us. They see that we have actually put something together where people of various diversities, different backgrounds, religious backgrounds can live together in peace. And I think that's a model for the world. And people are looking at us and saying, how do we do that? But on top of that, of what we do domestically, what can we do internationally? Canada had played a major role in the past. We helped invent peacekeeping. That had Leslie B. Pearson get the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a major achievement. We've worked to have a landmine treaty ban, that numerous states in the hundreds have banned landmines, saving the lives of countless children, civilians across the planet in post-conflict settings. We've had the Canadian government in the past bring about something called the Responsibility to Protect, an initiative that came out of the failure to halt the genocide in Rwanda when Romeo Dallaire was left out, hanging out high to dry as 800,000 people were killed within a 100-day period. Canada brought the international community together, created the Responsibility to Protect that says that every country has a responsibility to protect their citizens from mass atrocity crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes and ethnic cleansing. And if you don't, then the international community has a responsibility to engage and try to prevent these crimes from happening. That is an enormous progress that is entirely because of Canada. And right now, about 12 years after it was adopted by the UN, we now have almost 60 countries that have a Responsibility to Protect focal point in their national governments working on these issues. So this is progress. Canada also supported the International Criminal Court, and we're re-engaging in peacekeeping, as Anthony said. And so there's an enormous amount of opportunity. However, I think we can do more. I think that we have to be a bit more ambitious and realize that if we don't put more of our national resources, our national intellectual capacity, and mobilize Canadian civil society groups to engage on promoting human rights internationally, we can make a bigger difference. And what I would argue is that we need to up our game. We need to put more resources, financial, to support human rights groups across the planet. We need to do more to help journalists who are facing extreme repression. We need to do more to help individual MPs from across the planet, such as The leader from Venezuela that was mentioned, the opposition leader, has been under house arrest and in and out of prison. We need to actually do more things and rebuild the architecture that was, to tell you the truth, was a lot of it was destroyed under the last government. We had here in Montreal, we had Rights and Democracy, the International Center for Rights and Democracy, that was shut down about 2 or 3 months before the Arab Spring, in which all these Arab countries imploded. And guess what? They needed help for people to build democracies, to help build a political party system, and also protect human rights. And we were robbed of that capacity. So I would argue that one way forward is that we should start investing in these organizations. I've worked with the Armenian community last summer to make Montreal a human rights city. Worked with Mary Deros and the former mayor of Montreal, Denis Coderre, to tell the world that Montreal is an open city for human rights, and that we are, after New York City, we have the largest UN presence. Why not go to the next step and make a national project to make Montreal the Geneva of North America, to make Montreal the center of human rights, where we start bringing more international organizations here, bring more international conferences here, and really use our place, our stability on this troubled world to promote human rights and protect human rights. Because if we don't protect human rights abroad, it's going to impact our human rights here. And I would argue that it's in our national interest to do so.
Thank you, both of you. I have to say, I do like the idea of Montreal as Geneva of North America.
With better food.
Oh, okay. We'll work on that too. So we now are going to take questions from our various audiences that are with us live. Okay. Are we going to hear these questions?
Sure, hope so. Kind of hard to answer something when you don't really hear it.
That may help. Oh. Looks like
Our other guest is here,
yes,
so
Mr. Cutler is about to join. And maybe before we take questions, we can I can pose the same question to Mr. Cutler, or are we taking questions now? Yeah. Okay. Have a seat.
Erwin, thank goodness you already read your bio, so we don't have to go through that again.
That's
You don't have to be burdened by it, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. So we'll now listen to Mr. Erwin Cutler's response to the question that I just posed, and I'll pose
Okay.
it once again. So the question that was asked and these two gentlemen kindly responded to was the following. What role do you see for Canada at a time when many countries are stepping away from policies that defend human rights, both internally and internationally?
Okay, first let me apologize for my lateness. I've gone to 2 other Nadon streets by mistake.
Oh, no.
And then happily we called the organizer and they directed us to the proper place. And I also regret not having been able to benefit from the comments of my co-panelists and your introduction of them as well. So I hope I'm not too disconnected from the discourse that has already been engaged in. But let me get right to the point in terms of how Canada can be a human rights leader internationally. And as it happens, we're meeting at a very interesting historical moment. There's a remembrance and reminder. It's the 150th anniversary of confederation, but millennia more when you take into account Indigenous peoples. Also the 35th anniversary year of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. So there's a revolutionary human rights dimension domestically, but internationally, we're on the eve of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10th, preceded by the Genocide Convention just before. And 2018 will be the 70th anniversary year of both. So it is an important time, both symbolically and otherwise, for Canada to take a moral, intellectual, political, juridical lead in terms of international human rights advocacy and the pursuit of international justice. Now, I have to say that over the last year, there have been important developments, and developments in which government have cooperated with the Canadian Parliament in taking the lead internationally. I'm referring, among other things, to the adoption, belatedly, but finally and importantly, global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation to bring human rights violators to justice. I'm referring also to Canada's engagement, again belatedly, but necessarily, with the Organization of American States, the hosting of the Lima foreign ministers from the Western Hemisphere, particularly with regard to the deterioration of human rights in Venezuela. Canada hosting as well a group of countries with regard to combating recruitment of child soldiers and preventing that. And I can go through a number of other initiatives, and I would mention also the importance, again belatedly, but finally, because we're meeting now in the immediate aftermath of the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was the focal point of the Prime Minister's address at the UN General Assembly. But having said that, there are a number of important initiatives, I would say responsibilities, that we must undertake at this point in time. The first is the need, and I suspect this may have already been addressed, the need to take a lead in the preventing and combating of mass atrocity and genocide. If there is one issue in which the international community has been derelict, and I include Canada in it, it's in our absence in the preventing and combating of mass atrocity and genocide. Indeed, the indifference and inaction in the face of it. Just take, I'm not even referring to the classic genocides of which we speak. I'm referring to recent ones, referring to the horrific genocide in Rwanda, followed by what happened in Darfur, followed by Syria, followed as we meet with what is happening with the Rohingya. One thing that we learned from all this, I would hope, is that what makes these genocides so horrific is not only the fact of the genocide itself, but that these genocides were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And as we meet, of course, the catastrophes in Syria and in more recently now the Rohingya continue to act themselves out. And again, I just want to say that the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, of which I was vice chair, 4 years ago, tried to warn of and sound the alarm on what was potentially about to happen with the Rohingya. And I remember we called the press conference at the time, and no media came. And when I bumped into some media after in the parliamentary lobby, and they said, oh, you were talking about something like ringi. The very term Rohingya meant nothing to them. And then they say, oh, by the way, we would have come maybe, but we were preoccupied with looking into sexual allegations against MPs in your own party. I said, I always thought that you guys can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I'm using that as just one example and of the failure of the media as well. But what is necessary now, and in this, both Anthony and Kyle believe, what is necessary now is for Canada to reaffirm and implement the responsibility to protect doctrine. And for purposes of implementing, to set up focal points in the Canadian government where we have an early warning system for the prevention of mass atrocity, as well as for purposes of combating it. That's the first thing I think is crucial. I might just very quickly, at the same time, look at notes that I won't go in. Second thing would be the need to prevent and combat state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. If you look at the genocides to which I've referred, one of the common characteristics in all of them is that they began with state-sanctioned cultures of hate and incitement to genocide. Yet in each case, not one member of the international community, I include Canada, not one member of the international community undertook its elementary responsibility to hold these governments to account for engaging in what remains a standing violation of the Genocide Convention's prohibition against the incitement to genocide. A third thing, and very importantly, would be the combating of impunity, of bringing war criminals to justice. At the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century have been the ages of atrocity. They've also been the ages of impunity. Few of the war criminals have been brought to justice. And when you don't bring war criminals to justice, what you do is enable future war criminals and future war crimes, let alone the fact that we know that we have several hundred, and that's at a modest appreciation, several hundred war criminals wandering around Canada in our midst who've yet to be brought to justice. And I just want to say that when we do get to the point of deporting them, that's not justice. What we need to do is to bring them to justice and prosecute them for their war crimes here in Canada. After all, that was the purpose of enacting the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity law in the year 2000 and having a war crimes unit in the Department of Justice for that purpose. Finally, I'll end here with reference to the need to engage more at the UN, to reform the UN in such a way that we don't have a situation where, as in the UN Human Rights Council, which has been established for the promotion and protection of human rights, and yet we continuously elect human rights violators to the UN Human Rights Council. We've got to put an end to that culture of impunity at the UN itself. So these are just some suggestions how we might take the lead.
Thank you very much. All three responses were extremely comprehensive and insightful. I think we're now ready to take questions.
So, it's a general one, but I'd like you to use this. Erwin Cutler mentioned the Magnitsky Act. So how and do you find the Magnitsky Act to be a useful tool?
I think it's a useful tool because it was established in memory of Sergei Magnitsky. How many people here have heard of Sergei Magnitsky? Don't be embarrassed not to put up your hand because I find most people have never heard. Okay, so let me, as I sense that most people have not heard, let me just give you a very quick snapshot of how this came into being, and that will relate to how effective we can make it be. Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer who was acting on behalf of the largest corporate investor in Russia, the UK-based firm Hermitage Capital. In that capacity, he uncovered the largest corporate tax fraud in the history of Russia. He blew the whistle, unmasked, and exposed the Russian officials, leading senior officials in various Russian departments who had perpetrated this tax fraud. Rather than Russia then bring them to justice, they rewarded them, and worse, allowed the same people who had perpetrated the corporate tax fraud to arrange for the arrest, detention, imprisonment, torture, and murder of Sergei Magnitsky in prison, and he was murdered in November 2009. I was approached shortly thereafter by Bill Browder, the head of Hermitage Capital, that UK-based firm, who then made it his life's mission, because he knew he couldn't bring the perpetrators in Russia to justice, to make sure that other countries will not give them the impunity that they had. And so he asked other countries to enact justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation that would impose visa bans, put an end to the laundering of their proceeds, in other words, seize their proceeds that have been illegally obtained from their criminality, and ensure that people would not engage in business with them. To sum it up, this process began in 2010. As I said, it took a while. Finally, Canada became the fourth country in the world to join the United States, Britain, and a very courageous country, Estonia, on the border with Russia, which adopted such legislation. And the important development is it's not just targeting Russia, it is global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation in order to target any human rights violators from any country who engage in gross violations of human rights, to impose visa bans against them, asset seizures, and the like. And I'm delighted, shortly after the Canadian Parliament, and that includes parliamentarians from all parties, and in this, Anthony was a leader in that regard, parliamentarians from all parties unanimously voted to adopt this legislation. Shortly thereafter, the Canadian government imposed sanctions on 30 of the Russians involved in Sergei Magnitsky, on 19 Venezuelans who are involved now in the culture of corruption and criminality in Venezuela, and on 3 South Sudanese. I hope that that's just the beginning, because this was global justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation. But it shows that when parliamentarians from all parties come together and act in unison, and do so even in the face of a threat by Russia that 3 weeks before we passed the legislation warned Canada and Canadian parliamentarians not to go ahead with it, the response was, we won't be intimidated, and we not only will adopt the legislation, but we will adopt it unanimously.
And one thing that I think should be highlighted is Erwin Cutler's very important role in ensuring that Magnitsky Act was passed, not only while he was an MP, but post him being an MP, by constantly reminding everyone in Ottawa through the Wallenberg Caucus that he established for us in Ottawa, and in other ways to remind us how important it is. And it goes to show how difficult it is sometimes for governments to act, because you would think it would be an automatic that when something like that is proposed, it makes common sense that you don't have perpetrators of atrocities or murderers that are allowed to have their assets here in Canada or enter Canada. But you then get government pushback, people saying, well, what if we do that? How will it affect trade with Russia? How will Venezuela react in terms of oil, etc.? And you need to be strong at that time, and you need to say there's a certain limit. You have to be realistic and pragmatic, but there's a certain limit where human rights have to be heralded. And Erwin is always a leader in that. And I mean, you look at it with Putin, right? Putin threatened. Erwin is actually banned from entering Russia. It's one of the badges of honor that he wears. He is not allowed into Russia. But we didn't react. I mean, Putin the other day, as you know, never interfered in the US election. He told Trump that, and Trump said, I listened to him, and he absolutely did not interfere because I believe what he said. So we easily could have. He said he didn't do anything to Magnitsky. He said Russians had nothing to do with it. Magnitsky mysteriously must have had a heart attack while he was in prison. But, you know, there's a certain time when credulity is stretched and you need to act. And this is one of the times where, and I have to also compliment Chrystia Freeland. Chrystia Freeland, as Foreign Affairs Minister, was right to say, we're going to do it. We're going to get it done. She listened to the Human Rights Committee the Human Rights Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who recommended to proceed, and parties throughout Parliament got together. And this is one of the instances where you can say there's too much partisanship that we have in Ottawa, but this is one time that we really got it right.
And if I could just add one thing, I think if you look at the reactions of the Russian government to what the Canadian government introduced, and the anger and the threats that were made, that tells you how effective it's going to be. When a government responds to legislation, threatening, acting, having a hissy fit like a 7-year-old, that tells you that this is the right policy to pursue. And if we look at everything that's been done in the last 20 years, mass sanctions of countries is not the best way to go about things. It hurts the human rights of the general population. But if you can do targeted sanctions and travel bans against individual leaders in government who you know are behind these human rights abuses, that's probably the most effective way to move ahead.
Thank you. I think we have a second question.
I have a question coming in from Vancouver that addresses Saudi Arabia. And the question is, in light of Canada's role as an international human rights leader, how can the recent sale of light armored vehicles be justified? We've heard this in the press as well.
Who would like to?
Whoever wants to get first off.
I'm not a politician or a foreign politician, so I can speak clearly on this. I think that we should be very careful about selling weapons to Saudi Arabia for multiple reasons. A, it's an authoritarian state. B, it's imprisoned Raf Badawi, and his wife is sitting here with her kids in Sherbrooke, asking for him to be released. And third, Saudi Arabia is involved in a very, very nasty war in Yemen. That's leading to public health outbreaks, starvation, recruitment of child soldiers, you name it. There's some really nasty stuff going on in the neighborhood of Saudi Arabia. And I think we should be very apprehensive about taking the Saudi Arabian government at its word. That's my opinion alone.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to say I'm no longer a politician, but as a politician, I opposed the arms sale to Saudi Arabia when the conservative government first proposed it. Then when the liberal government came into power, I was no longer a parliamentarian. They then went along with the sale. I continued to oppose it. The liberals felt that they were obliged by the conservative government's contracting. I did not agree to that. But the important thing is that we have now become a state party to the arms trade treaty, which will now prevent us from arms sales to human rights violators. A second thing, and it was mentioned by Kyle, and that is with regard to Raif Badawi, we have now passed the 2,000 days of his imprisonment. He's been imprisoned, not only to 10 years imprisonment, but 1,000 lashes, of which after the first 50 were administered, they didn't go ahead happily with others. But we have a situation here where there's not only a Canadian connection in that his wife and children have refugee status, but Saudi Arabia is in standing obligation of international treaties to which Canada and Saudi Arabia are both state parties, like the Torture Convention, etc., let alone violations of its own domestic law and Sharia law in a matter of imprisonment, not only of Raif Badawi, that would be bad enough, but his lawyer was imprisoned for 15 years to send a message that if you take up the case of human rights defenders like Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, you may liable yourself to even more imprisonment. So I would hope, and we are in a situation now where we have a new leadership in Saudi Arabia. The Crown Prince has announced a whole series of reforms, anti-corruption reforms, economic reforms, countering religious extremism and the like, all of which are encouraging and I applaud. But regrettably, when it comes to the issue of human rights defenders, for example, on the same day that he announced that women would now have the right to drive, and that got headlines internationally, what was not reported was that leading human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia were arrested and imprisoned at the same time. So when it comes to the issue of promotion and protection of human rights and those human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia who bravely affirm it, I think the Prince has to move on that issue as well. And I would hope Canada, in our own discussions with Saudi Arabia, can make that point.
Do we have time for another question? Okay. Yes.
Yes, Dr. Cutler, first of all, allow me to say that God knows how much Armenians are proud of you, appreciate you, because the hard work that you've done for the recognition of the Armenian Genocide to our Canadian Parliament. Here, there are very few people maybe knows how hard did you work at that time. I'm saying this because we have youth here. I want them to know who you are. My question, after recognition of the Armenian genocide from our parliament, I'd like to hear your comments on what is the way to bring up this issue, the Armenian genocide issue, on international level. And please let me allow me to comment on Anthony's that says you were banned to enter to Russia, right? Is that what you said, Anthony?
I couldn't hear you.
You're banned. Dr.
No,
Cutler
everyone
was
is
banned.
Everyone is banned.
He was banned to cut. I'm
I
sure
haven't
if you
been
go
banned
to
yet.
if you go to Armenia, Dr. Cutler, you will be very welcome.
Okay, with regard to Armenia, no, we are talking about, the first genocide of the 20th century. And that should not be forgotten. Also, what Hitler said at the time on the way to the Holocaust, when he said, who today remembers the Armenians? And maybe had we remembered the Armenians then and the Armenian genocide, we might have then started on the road to the preventing and combating of genocide. And I think at this point, for example, the Canadian Parliament has established April as Genocide Prevention Month. And we recognize 5 genocides. The first is the Armenian genocide. But I think we have a role, if not a responsibility, to see to it that the Armenian genocide is not only recognized and affirmed in Canada and taught in schools and the like, but that internationally this genocide is recognized and affirmed. Because we should not continue to have a situation where Turkish authoritarians can continue to mock and flaunt the recognition of that Armenian genocide. And I say this because, when we commemorate the Armenian genocide on Parliament Hill, regrettably, Armenians have had to experience, and those who are there in support of that commemoration, have had to experience others coming to not only protest, but interfere with that commemoration. And I have said, look, if there are those who want to protest, we have freedom to protest in this country, that's right. They don't have to be given the right to protest exactly adjacent to where the Armenians are protesting and where Parliament is commemorating the Armenian genocide. And we do have a right to regulate a time and place of protest, and I think we should do that in the case of our commemoration of the Armenian genocide. And as I say, take a lead internationally in the recognition and affirmation of that in other countries and at the UN.
Yes, we'll quickly add. Go for it.
I just wanted to add, I completely agree with Erwin as relates to the Armenian genocide, and I very much hope that we will soon have a genocide curriculum in schools across the country that allows elementary and secondary students to learn about the different genocides that have been perpetrated over the last 101 years, if you start with the Armenian one. What I wanted to mention is, despite the recognition of the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust and what happened in Rwanda by the Canadian Parliament, we still face this situation. And I want to talk to you about the most difficult day I've had as a member of Parliament. It was last year, where there was an Opposition Day resolution to recognize the Yazidis genocide. And the government, the Foreign Affairs Minister, refused to support that resolution. And they did so on the argument that, well, it has not yet been recognized by the United Nations, which I have never understood in any legal framework to be a precondition for a sovereign parliament such as Canada to recognize a genocide. And I had to be one of the 4 liberals that voted against my own government in that issue because it was an issue of conscience. How can I go tell people that you have to recognize the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust and what happened in Rwanda when I have an opportunity in the House to recognize what is happening today to the Yazidis, and people are telling me, no, you shouldn't. And of course, a few days later, after we had humiliatingly voted against the resolution to recognize the Yazidi genocide, the Foreign Affairs Minister had to correct himself and recognize the genocide because suddenly there was a report from the United Nations. But we are still at a point. We are still at a point where Parliament is having difficulty truly recognizing when a genocide is happening. There are so many political pressures out there. So while I completely support 100% that we have to go out there and internationally make sure that the Armenian genocide is recognized by all instances, we still have a problem here in Canada when it comes to recognizing what's happening in the rest of the world and taking action.
Thank you. Okay, we'll now move on to our second question. Great. Okay. So our second and final question for the panel is the following. One of the major blemishes on Canada's human rights record is the treatment of the First Nations communities. How can the multicultural groups of Canadian society be enlisted in the healing process? Whoever would like to.
I'll kick at this. I'm not an expert on Indigenous Canadians, or do I have all the information on what happened to Indigenous Canadians through the phases of European settlement in what is now Canada, as well as the rights, the wrongs of the past, and the residential school system. Although I'm very, what I look at, we talked about this denialism of Turkey towards the Armenians, and then we look at what we're doing in Canada now, and I think we're on the right track. I think that we are finally, as a country, waking up. We're having a national inquiry. We're trying to come to grips with what happened, and I think that's very positive. And I get the sense among a lot of everyday Canadians, as well as people that are working on prevention of genocide and mass atrocity crimes, to realize that something in our past is a dark chapter, but we have the chance to write the next chapter, a positive one. And I would argue that while there might be a gulf between Indigenous communities and Canadians that we need to bring ourselves together, I think that many of the communities in Canada that came here seeking protection, fleeing genocide, like the Jewish community of Canada, the Armenian community, you guys have a role. You've shared a similar experience, and you can play that role. And I would maybe, my last comment to say, one of the most amazing things that I've done in my work at university is working with all these different cultural groups here in Montreal that have dealing with painful past and have been survivors of genocide, and have worked together to have an annual march against genocide. It started off on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, had I think 15,000 people in the streets of Montreal. Did it 2 years ago. It was cold weather, held on Mother's Day. We only had about 4,000 or 5,000. And last year we brought together with a big event with Irwin's organization, Amnesty International, had about 10,000 people out there. And I would love to say, let's invite the Indigenous communities of Canada to join this march, so we can share our experiences and work together.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
I think it's a wonderful idea. I mean, I think we have to be careful not to compare ourselves to the Indigenous experience. It's one of the things that I've learned, that we need to be. Every group has its own pain. Every group has its own story, and while there are parallels to be made, it's very difficult in terms of Indigenous Canadians for us to put ourselves in their shoes. We have many Indigenous peoples in this country who, for the last many hundreds of years, have been moved away from their land, have lost their hunting and fishing rights, have seen their land deteriorate as we have occupied it, and it's something that I think, as Kyle said, I think we're on the right track now. I think we're recognizing where historic wrongs have existed. We're apologizing. We're seeking reconciliation. I mean, one of the greatest people ever in our lifetime was, again, somebody that Irwin represented, Nelson Mandela, who managed to successfully turn an apartheid regime in South Africa into a rainbow nation precisely because he didn't seek to be vindictive. He sought truth and reconciliation. And I think the approach is right. We need more money to be put into it. We need to better have an understanding of one another. I think one of the things that's amazing right now is, for example, University of Victoria has launched the first Indigenous legal studies program in Canada that teaches Indigenous students common law, but teaches non-Indigenous students Indigenous customs and framework. And the more we can understand when we negotiate with one another what all of the traditions that we have in this country are, the better. But again, I salute Kyle's idea. I think it's a wonderful thing to invite the Indigenous groups to that march.
I want to also mention the importance of inviting the Indigenous peoples, and I think that would be a very timely and symbolically, as well as substantively important initiative, Carl. Now, I'm recalling now that when I was appointed Minister of Justice, right after the swearing in, as it turned out, the first meeting I had with any group in Canada was with a group, as they called the Aboriginal law students from HREC Law School in Nunavut. And they came to me, and it was a very, I think, compelling meeting in many respects. But I won't forget their remarks. They said, you know, Professor Carter, we're not just law students. We're Aboriginal law students. We come with a past, with a history, the heritage, their own land, their own spirituality, with their own language, their own education, and we've been dispossessed from all that. We've been dislocated from our history and our heritage and our land and our values. And they went on, they said, and what troubles us most is that in everything we do, we are accompanied by a great deal of pain, because we believe that the Canadian government and the Canadian people don't understand who we are, where we've come from, and what we aspire to be. And so I sought to respond to them by first beginning sharing with them a parable I said that came out of a Talmudic tradition, but traditions of other peoples as well. It's where students come to their rabbi and they say, "Rabbi, we love you." And the rabbi says, "Do you know what hurts me?" And the students say, "Rabbi, why do you ask if we know what hurts you if we tell you we love you?" And the rabbi says, "Because if you don't know what hurts me, you can't tell me you love me." Now that's a profound principle of human relationships. And as I shared then with the Indigenous law students, I said, we will try as a government as best we can, while we cannot fully appreciate or comprehend your pain, but we'll try to relate to you in terms of where you've come from, where you are, what you aspire to be. And shortly after that, as Minister of Justice, I enunciated what I called the 7 R's of Aboriginal justice. And I'm just going to close my response by sharing it with you, because I think there's a place for us as minority communities, as civil society, to also embrace those 7 R's, because they're not just for governments, they're for people in civil society and maybe minority communities with particular heritage of persecution. The first is the importance of the recognition of Indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this country. I know when we celebrated the 150th anniversary of Confederation, Indigenous peoples felt that they were being left out of that celebration by reason of the fact that it was labeled the 150th anniversary. And so that's why I think the Prime Minister, in his speech to the General Assembly of the UN, said 150th anniversary, yes, but we have to appreciate 150th anniversary of Confederation, but backed by millennia of Aboriginal peoples living here. Second R is respect. Respect for their distinctive constitutional and legal system, as finds expression in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and otherwise. And Anthony mentioned the important initiative now at the University of Victoria Law School. The third R is redress. Redress for past and continuing wrongs. And so I'm not referring only to the residential school system, but the continuing wrongs, murdered and missing Indigenous women as an example. The fourth R is the double entendre, the double meaning of representation, of combating the over-representation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system as inmates and the like, and their under-representation in the justice system as judges, as lawyers, as law enforcement officers, and the like. The fifth R is responsiveness, that we need to be responsive in our government decision-making, for example, in matters of resource development, that we ensure, and now jurisprudence has made it, in fact, a law in this country, that the governments must consult with Indigenous peoples and their leadership with respect to resource development and seeking a proper accommodation. The sixth R is, if we do the first 5 R's, we'll get to reconciliation and The seventh R is renewal. The renewal of a relationship between the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous peoples, and their governments, but also between peoples, as well as between governments. And here's where I think we have a role and where we can join in concert with them. And I'm, as Kyle has mentioned, at the next March for Humanity Against Inhumanity, we'll be marching with them.
And just to note that in terms of what Erwin just said, there was a very important Supreme Court decision this week
That's right.
on resource management in the Yukon that basically said the government of the Yukon acted in bad faith when it dismissed the recommendations of after negotiation with the Indigenous communities and wanted to develop far more of the land than was recommended by the I don't know if it was an independent mediator, but that was a very important judgment that basically said you not only have a duty to negotiate, you have to do so in good faith.
Okay. Thank you very much for these responses. We're now going to take 2 questions from our audiences across Canada. So our first one, please.
Yes. Just before I go into the question, I would like to acknowledge that Mrs. Émilie Thuillier, who is Borough Mayor for Arse-Cartierville, is with us today. Thank you. Mr. Cutler, this morning, as we opened this conference, Jessica Labranche, who is the principal at Black Feather Law Professional Corporation, sadly, and this is not a question, but I'm just reporting back what she said this morning at her conference. She stated that, unfortunately, litigation is the only reason why the Canadian government is addressing residential school issues. In light of all that's been said here at this panel, do you think that's a fair statement? And then I have a second question.
Well, I think we came, 2 things I'll say about that. We came too late to the issue of addressing residential school settlements. And I have to say that the reason we finally did come to it was because of Paul Martin when he was Prime Minister, who felt that the time had come for a resolution not only of the residential school tragedy, but also for a formal apology and the like. So yes, the litigation was involved, but not only litigation. You needed a government decision-making. And one of the great things about Paul Martin was his overriding commitment to Aboriginal justice, which he's continued since no longer being Prime Minister, and has made it a priority in his own public and even in his private involvements. So I think it's, yes, litigation was important, but it wouldn't have come about only through litigation. And I want to say that when I came in as Justice Minister, I sought to resolve these cases without litigation, because I felt that litigation was prolonging the pain and prolonging the resolution. And sometimes litigation can even be a barrier with regard to a just and efficient resolution. So yes, litigation when necessary, but not necessarily litigation. And better to have proper government, parliamentary, and civil society initiatives and involvement so that litigation is not necessary.
Would anyone else like to respond?
Sure. I mean, I think you can never say a question is a truism because you don't know what historically would have happened had something that actually happened never happened, right? So to say that litigation, if litigation had never ensued, you would not have had that type of an apology and that type of an action, you never know. Litigation can sometimes push things along, but I agree with Erwin that I think I'm very doubtful that absent litigation, nothing would have happened. But let's look, for example, at something I'm more familiar with because it's more recent and I've been a member of parliament. This week, there was an absolutely historic apology in the House of Commons to Canada's LGBTQ plus community. And it was something that was memorable. It was something that was compelling. It was something that was needed. And it was something that occurred because both the government and the Prime Minister absolutely believed in it. And it settled a litigation that had taken place by people who had been very, very wronged a multitude of public servants and military personnel who are unjustly fired from their jobs, had multiple problems caused for them in their lives because of the actions of the government of Canada. Now, the lawyer of the litigation, Doug Elliott, may well tell you, had he not brought that litigation, perhaps there would not have been $150 million offered by the government of Canada to the people who were victimized. But do I think the apology wouldn't have happened? I think the apology probably would have happened. So it's not an unfair comment, but I don't think it's a truly accurate comment would be my assessment.
Okay. Kyle, would you like to chime in?
I really don't have the knowledge to talk about this legislation, but I would just add to what Erwin said, is that I've done some work with Paul Martin, and you see that once he's left office and his Martin Aboriginal initiative, I mean, his heart is in there. I think it's the closest thing to his heart to what he's working on now. And I think it's powerful that we're having former political leaders that are leaving office and they're dedicating their time and their resources, their connections to try to help bring some closure and bring healing and justice for Indigenous Canadians. So I think that's a positive thing.
Thank you for your responses. We're going to take one more question.
Good afternoon. As a third generation Armenian genocide survivor, I feel extremely proud that we're sitting today here in an Armenian school and discussing about prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. I feel the responsibility as a person to dedicate my whole life so that these atrocities don't happen again. And my feeling was at the peak when, like Kyle discussed it 2 years ago, we marched more than 10,000 people in Montreal for March for Humanity and Prevention of Genocide. And Kyle, I think that's an amazing idea to invite Indigenous communities next year, and I'll make sure that they are invited and part of this march. And I feel that we're pushing Canada, government, and all NGOs to continue working on the prevention. And I think there's a lot to do still. But putting genocide prevention aside, during the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, there's this trend in some of the governments around the world of mass arrests to silence opposition. We saw it happening in Turkey when thousands of people were arrested, including politicians, professors, university professors, school teachers. We're seeing it, we saw it lately in Saudi Arabia. We saw it in Azerbaijan and other countries. I want to know, as Canada, as government, and also as different organizations, what are we doing as a response to those arrests, and how can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? Thank you.
I'm happy to take the first kick of the can of this question.
Go for it.
I'm not sitting in on these meetings like a fly on the wall when the Prime Minister meets Erdogan or at a G20 meeting or what happens, when leaders meet. But my overall sense, particularly with Turkey, is that I think NATO members that are in NATO with Turkey have been very, very careful in not criticizing Erdogan when, in fact, he is becoming, I think, a death wish for his people. And I say that in entirely being serious, in which he's taking his country to be an authoritarian state. We have numerous, I think every dean in most universities have been fired, thousands of professors, every free media is being closed down, political opposition have been criminalized, thrown in jail. He's been funding groups like Daesh, ISIS. He's trying to hold mass rallies in European countries to mobilize his votes in order that he'd be a supreme leader almost Turkey, and he did. But the reaction that you saw when Netherlands and Germany, I mean, two of the probably the greatest democracies on the planet right now with the best human rights record, he turned around and called them both Nazi regimes. I mean, this is not behavior of a sane government. It's not a behavior of a statesman. And I'm very, very fearful that Western countries, Western democracies have totally allowed Erdogan to assume total power, and we haven't used any of the levers at our control, be it trade, be it NATO membership, you name it. I think there's things we can do, and I think the time has come that we speak publicly about what's happening in Turkey.
I would strongly second what Kyle has mentioned. I mean, what you're seeing in Turkey today is a pervasive, criminalization of dissent and domestic oppression, which is affecting every aspect of civil society, including imprisonment of judges, human rights defenders, leaders of the democratic opposition, etc., all well known to you. But Turkey is also emblematic of a phenomenon that is increasingly evident and worrisome, and that is a resurgent global authoritarianism. Finds expression not only in Turkey, but in Russia and China, in Iran, North Korea, and the like. And that resurgent global authoritarianism is also taking place at the time that we have a growing illiberal populism in some of the Western democracies, and also with democracy itself being in retreat, an absence really of moral and democratic and political leadership by the community of democracies, and in particular with regard to the United States. That's why a number of us gathered in Prague in October, what was called Forum 2000, which is the society created by Václav Havel, great Czech Democrat. And at this gathering, we adopted the Prague Declaration for Democratic Renewal, amongst its initiatives being establishing an international coalition of democratic renewal, to mobilize the community of democracies to combat this resurgent global authoritarianism, this liberal populism, and to reaffirm and reassert the democratic idea, the importance of liberal democracies and democratic institutions and all. I'm hoping that Canada will take a lead role now in this international coalition for democratic renewal. Number one. Number two, just on the matter of the resurgent global authoritarianism and political prisoners and the like, next week or this week in Ottawa on Thursday, December 7th, with Anthony's help, we will be bringing together a number of political families of political prisoners from countries that have oppressed them, but with a specific Canadian connection, such as Saudi Arabia in the person of Raif Badawi's wife, who will be there. And the hope is that we will not only shine a spotlight on these human rights violating the countries through the presence of the families of the political prisoners, but that this meeting can be used to help sound the alarm on what is happening, to help free political prisoners, and in the spirit of Nelson Mandela, the importance of freeing political prisoners. Let us always remember that Nelson Mandela endured 27 years in a South African prison to emerge to not only preside over dismantling of apartheid, but to become the first president of a first ever democratic, egalitarian, non-racial South Africa. That tells you something about the importance of freeing political prisoners, whether it be a Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia or Leopoldo Lopez in Venezuela. We can have a transformative impact in freeing them on the authoritarian situation in their countries.
Just to finish off on the question, I mean, obviously Ataturk would be spinning in his grave if he saw the amendments to the Constitution that were recently passed in Turkey. But we have a difficult situation now, whether it's Turkey with by a small majority, amending the Constitution, the United States by a 3 million vote deficit by a majority in the Electoral College electing Trump, Brexit, where democracies are actually having a majority of voters, or whatever the system is, winning elections based on a native populism. And in a sense, it becomes more and more difficult at that point, because nobody could argue that a majority of Russian voters, at least at the time of the last election, didn't support Putin. you can't argue that Erdogan didn't actually win the last Turkish election. You know, if you follow the US constitutional system, you can't argue Trump didn't win the last election unless we find more information about Russian meddling that would, you know, that would go to that core. But then you have a question of duly elected governments that are using repressive measures, and which may even be, in some instances, if they reform their constitution, to get a democratic majority to amend the constitution in line with the constitution. And then you have us as a foreign government saying, but you're not respecting human rights. And to me, the answer here is an interesting question that I've been debating with or grappling with in my head as I write questions for the new Supreme Court justice who we're going to be asking questions to on Tuesday. And that is the misconception of what the word democracy actually means. Because democracy itself is not what safeguards human rights. It's an important tool of government, but it's actually constitutional freedoms that are overseen by an independent judiciary that safeguard human rights. You can have a majority of people in a state that vote to repress or support the repression of minority groups in their state, that support mass arrests of people they disagree with. It's very unfortunate, but it exists. And that goes to show that we need not only democracy, we need to make sure that throughout the world, we have constitutional supremacy that safeguards human rights and not simply a parliamentary supremacy or a democracy. And it's a very difficult thing to grapple with when I go to the government and I say to the foreign affairs minister, we need to intervene. There have been mass arrests in this country, but it's a democratically elected government following their own constitution. And you end up in a situation where nobody wants to intervene because it becomes a quandary. It's a lot easier in the case of a hated despot who wasn't democratically elected to argue that they're repressing their people than it is in the case of a democratically elected leader.
Yes. Point. Okay, it seems like there are no more questions that we can take. Can we take one more question? Just one moment, can we? Okay, yes, briefly, yes. Where?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
The crowd.
Okay.
Yes, there's some. Thank you very much for this last question opportunity, and thank you, merci beaucoup, Madame, I'm really honored to be in your presence, Mr. Cutler, Mr. Matthews, Mr. Housewater as well. Just developing on your last point where you said it's not democracies, but it's also falling off a framework where we could very well have a democracy in which people unanimously vote for or unanimously agree that a minority would be oppressed. And developing on Mr. Cutler's comments on or sharing with us about how 4 years ago you were at the press conference in the parliament and people didn't even know what is Rohingya or they didn't show up. Today, we have 625,000 people, sir, that have crossed over to Bangladesh, and the massacre still continues. And now they talk about a deal between Bangladesh and Myanmar to push these people back who have witnessed with their own eyes their children burned alive or their neighbors hacked to death. And now they're going to be pushed back under this deal to go back to the same place where their villages have been burned to the ground. And despite all of this, despite the responsibility to protect, despite early warning mechanisms, what is missing, or what is it that we haven't taken concrete actions, or what can be done in order for something to materialize? Is it because there is no support, there is apathy? Is it because these people are just not worth it? What is it, sir? What would you say, please, to everyone who is here?
Thank you. Who would like to begin?
Go ahead.
I mean, obviously the Rohingyas are worth it, and Canada has taken it seriously enough to send Bob Rae to the region. And Minister Marie-Claude Bibeau, in charge of international development, was in the Bangladeshi refugee camps with the Rohingyas just last week, I am also deeply troubled by the idea of a negotiated settlement by Myanmar and Bangladesh that would send the Rohingyas back into Myanmar with no international guarantees and international presence to protect the Rohingyas. So I think what we have said is we need to read and study what the deal would actually say and what safeguards would be there before Canada would agree with that framework. But I completely agree with you. It's a deeply troubling prospect and very scary, again, that so little attention was paid to a minority group that has been abused in Myanmar for generations.
If I could speak as a former employee of the UN High Commission for Refugees, sending the Rohingya refugees back to Myanmar is against the principle of non-refoulement, which is against international law. So it's clear in my mind that whatever is being cooked up for political reasons or that it's against international law. So I think that has to be said loud and clear. Perhaps engagement with the UN High Commission for Refugees office here in Canada and internationally to kind of raise that, because it's definitely not safe. Houses being burnt down, from what I understand, most of the crops have been stolen by the Myanmar military. So what are people going to return to? The hunger? Just doesn't make sense. But I think perhaps the deeper question is, how can we use some of these Magnitsky laws to target those in the Myanmar government who we know are responsible for this? We know who the head of the military is who's directing these campaigns. We know who the people are. Let's start naming and shaming them. And it'd be interesting to see if a country, perhaps Canada, I don't know, could take that lead. But to this day, no one has spoken out loudly besides few people in Asia, a few celebrities. There hasn't been a head of state that's come out very forcefully and said, stop it, you're breaking international law and you're committing crimes against humanity. No one has said that publicly, and I think it needs to be said.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with both my colleagues on this. And with regard to the Rohingya, I think that there's multiple levels of intervention and protection that are needed, both for the close to 700,000 that are in Bangladesh, in terms of building what Justice Louise Otis once called justice shelters, which is humanitarian, et cetera, to ensure the protection and the safety and the security of those in Bangladesh. Not to forget the Rohingya who are still in Myanmar and protect them against any further ethnic cleansing, atrocity, violation of their rights and the like. And as Carl said, to hold those accountable who've been responsible for these violations and continue to be responsible. But I just want to say in closing that both in the case of the Rohingya, which is the latest and greatest humanitarian catastrophe being faced by the international community, and in the case of Syria, which was the greatest humanitarian catastrophe since the end of the Second World War. I mean, I don't know, we appreciate the incredulity. I don't like to use statistics because statistics, you know, behind every statistic is a human being. But when we think about the fact that some 600,000 have been killed in Syria, and 12.5 million that have been displaced, we think about the fact that we're talking about millions of refugees here, but the tragedies that it could have been preventable. We are about to approach what will be the 7th anniversary of the beginning of this tragedy. The March 2011, when a group of young people in Dara village, southern Syria, marched with olive branches saying, peace, peace, dignity, dignity. They were disappeared. Some of them were gunned down. Young people came to their assistance. Same thing happened. And then Assad began his scorched earth policy. And while there was a lot of talk about ISIS, and yes, ISIS is a horrific terrorist group that committed unspeakable atrocities, nonetheless, over 85% of the atrocities and murders were committed tragically by Assad's brutal regime. Now, at the end of 2011, which was, let's say, 6 years ago, a number of us wrote at the time that what was happening in Syria was a classic case for R2P, for the responsibility to protect a principle. And we then called for that type of R2P implementation. But those of us who were arguing for it were told, well, you know, if you intervene, this will lead to sectarian warfare, this will lead to civil war in Syria, this will lead to jihadists coming in. Everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we didn't intervene. And there's an important lesson in that, as with the Rohingya. I go back to what I said earlier, the necessity for the prevention so that we don't have to end up afterwards combating the mass atrocity and dealing with these horrific, not only atrocities, but refugee crises and the like, which are the consequences and not the cause of our dilemmas today. So again, we need a culture of prevention in international political leadership and the combating of mass atrocity. And I want to close just to say with a personal point of pride in being here with Kyle Matthews, who's been playing a leadership role in the preventing and combating of mass atrocities. As the executive director of MIGS, and what I told to somebody just last night, they said, do you regret no longer being a member of parliament? I said, not at all, because my greatest happiness is to know that I was succeeded by Anthony Housefather, who not only is an excellent former student of mine, but is an exemplary parliamentarian. So I'm delighted in that.
Well, on that fine note, I just want to take a moment to thank Mr. Cutler, Mr. Matthews, and Mr. Housefather for taking the time to be with us today. We are all humbled and honored for this extremely eye-opening, I'd say informative and engaging, also inspiring panel. We're truly grateful. Thank you very much. And we'll pass it on to Toronto, I believe.
And so we come to the end of our day, 7 hours later. For everyone who managed to be here the entire time, congratulations. And your reward will be that all I'm going to say is thank you to our executive sponsor, our sponsors, all our endorsers, the Government of Canada, all of our guests, all of the organizers, and everyone who came here and came for one panel or all the panels. Thank you very much for coming. Good night. See you next year.